Welcome to Building Secure Applications. I'm Justin, a Senior Solutions Architect working with nonprofit, government, and healthcare, and other public sector customers.
Hi, and I'm Mike Colson, a DoD Solutions Architect Manager working with U.S. Air Force, Army, and Combatant Commands. And on last episode of Building Secure Apps, we talked about how code isn't static and securing your CI/CD pipeline and how to secure applications through that development process. This week, we're going to talk about everyone's favorite subject, compliance. While it can be a little sleepy, I think we're going to have a little bit of fun with it. We're going to talk through, how you can build secure applications, how you can be ready to have them go through the compliance regime that your organization has to go through for approval process, and really kind of walk through what the hurdles are and some of the misnomers and confusion.
Sure, and acronyms.
Yeah.
So before we get started, let's toss it over to the lounge and say hello to...
Hi, I'm Ted. I'm a solutions architect working with public sector customers. And with us today is Muggsy, the AWS Mug. He doesn't talk very much.
So we're going to start off by talking about NIST.
Yeah, so what is NIST, Justin?
NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is out of the U.S. Department of Commerce.
Yeah, that's impressive. So what NIST does is they actually take the standard risks that they're assessing across global risk, global security infractions, information security vulnerabilities, and they have a framework that they apply to the process for creating things like information assurance actions and vulnerability assessments. So the NIST framework, would you like to walk through it for us?
Well, I just pulled up the NIST framework, and really this is all about, this is why we care, before we dive in too deeply, it's all about managing risk here, right? And you'll see it's a life cycle, and Mike can absolutely talk through the life cycle of this risk management framework.
Yeah.
But let's start through that, and then we'll talk about why this is important.
Yeah, so when you are thinking about how you look at risk, it's really about understanding what the risks are, and then making determinations of, are you going to be able to mitigate, are you going to be able to accept, are you going to be able to avoid, are you going to be able to exchange risk? So the first part of the framework is really categorization. So what type of risks are there? What kind of data do you have? What's the categorization of the information system that's underlying? And then based off of that information, right now I have bucketized the environment that I need to perform my risk assessment on. I select the security controls that are most relevant to that environment. And then I go through the process of implementing those security controls. And then I have to assess against the security controls that I've implemented to ensure that I haven't exposed myself to additional vulnerabilities. From there, we can go through an authorization process, which some of you may be familiar with, like an ATO, or authority to operate, where you're actually putting together the artifacts of your environment to go through some form of authentication and authorization from higher bodies. And then in the end of that cycle, the tail end anyway, is the monitoring piece. And then you get this self-eating snake, right? Because at some point you have to start that process again, because as additional vulnerabilities come out or new assessments are made, you're going to continue to go through the process. But that framework is giving you the life cycle of how you continue to secure applications, and NIST is really helping from an institutional body in providing those for everyone else globally.
Right. Well, let's talk about what's built on top of this framework and this life cycle. Yeah. Right. And one of the things that this is fundamental to is FEDRAMP.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about FEDRAMP, and this is to give you a greater context for the rules of thumb that we want to take away from today's final episode.
Yeah. So FEDRAMP is just one of the informational bodies that are out there that do authorization. And so what AWS has done is looked at the NIST control sets, and so there's two main control sets that are used within FEDRAMP and also the Department of Defense Security Requirements Guide, or Commercial Cloud Security Requirements Guide, also known as the DoD CCSRG, acronym fun. And so those are the 800-53 controls, which cover security and privacy controls for federal information systems and operations. And then the NIST 800-171 controls, which cover the protecting controlled unclassified information in non-federal systems and organizations.
Now, we've said controls and security controls a couple of times,
Yeah.
and not everyone might understand what that looks like. So let's dig into that a little bit using some NIST guidelines.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So one of the things that we're going to start showing you is the fact that AWS has done a mapping of NIST controls to an AWS Quick Start and services. And so within this NIST Quick Start, we also have mapped in an Excel sheet those NIST controls, and you can actually look in and drill into the NIST compliance piece, and it'll show you, okay, this is how AWS services map to those specific controls.
Yep.
This marks the inheritance piece, and so inheritance is a big word.
It is a big word.
In that inheritance is what you can gain and leverage when you're going through your authorization process. It becomes an artifact that you say whether or not that control applies to you, and whether or not the control is met by the AWS underlying service, or whether you have to perform some other function.
So let's break this down a little bit and maybe use a little less jargony terms.
Sure.
But let's say AWS is providing these services, and we're doing some of the undifferentiated heavy lifting on the services and the technology, right? The scaling and the elasticity for the compute, storage, network, these sorts of things. We're doing similar things and providing that inheritance, that pass through on some of our services. So we really need to understand where the delineation is between what we build and what we're responsible for and what AWS is responsible for. And that kind of brings us to our first rule of thumb. And here it is. It works out. And the first rule of thumb is the shared responsibility model.
Yeah. So to get to the shared responsibility model, let's first talk about how we got to FedRAMP. And so if we talk about there's a lot of CSPs or cloud service providers that have gone through the process of gaining FedRAMP certification. So you take that hundreds of CSPs applying for FedRAMP, and FedRAMP was good. At first, it was the governance body that said what CSPs or cloud service providers met the needs for the federal government. Well, then it kind of morphed over time. So we started mapping this to FISMA controls and saying, okay, well, how many of these NIST controls are needed to meet a FISMA moderate environment? And those came directly out of the NIST 853 control set, and had about 325 controls. And in that 53 control set, there's 18 families. And so, I'm sorry, 17 families now. So yeah, mess up my numbers. 17 control families, and that's everything from access control to systems and information security. But it covers things like maintenance. It covers things like physical security, like how do we do biometrics on doors, or how do we protect with overhead sprinkler systems or fire suppression. And so we take those controls, and that's how we mapped initially to the initial FedRAMP. But then FedRAMP said, we have this need for FISMA moderate, but we also have users that need FISMA high. And so to get to FISMA high, there was an additional set of controls. The DoD came along and said, we also have unique requirements. And so they accepted reciprocity between FISMA moderate and what they call the DoD CCSRG, Commercial Cloud Computing Security Requirements Guide, and impact levels. And so their impact level 2 actually maps to FISMA moderate. And it has a set of controls that are directly correlated, and that's all your publicly available, accessible data, right? When we get up to FISMA high, we start talking about that CCSRG mapping to impact levels 4 and 5. And there we're talking about things like PII, PHI, FOUO data. So we're talking about, PII is the personal identifiable information, PHI is personal health identifiable information, FOUO is for official use only. There's some other classifications that fall into there, but that's really that impact level 4 or FISMA high. And then for DoD, they have that next level up, which is the impact level 5, which is also the national security systems. So those environments, when we talk about FISMA high and we talk about the impact levels 4 and 5, those are our GovCloud regions where we've gone through and answered those control sets. We're adding 38 controls to go from FISMA moderate to FISMA high, and that also envelopes impact level 4, although there's no reciprocity there. And then impact level 5 is an additional 47 controls on top of that. Yeah, and it's all about implementing additional security so that the application owner understands the environment that they're running into, right?
Makes sense.
And so some of those are from us, and some of those are dictated by the end customer, and that goes into our shared security model. But before we get to our shared security model, I think we have a question. Ted?
Yes, so Omen King wanted to know if the two of you are going to reinforce this year.
I will not be at
I
Reinforce.
think I'm somewhere else.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Unfortunately, not at Reinforce, but we will be at the Public Sector Summit,
Yes, we will.
which is the week before, or 2 weeks before in June.
Yes.
And we'll get that link posted in the chat.
Yep.
Please come up and say hi.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
tell us how much you like the show, or punch Justin in the face. Either one. Oh, sorry, I lied. So this is how we get to security controls. Sorry, buddy.
Somebody's gonna do that. You know that.
That's how it works.
What are you gonna do?
All fun and games. So
well, listen, we said, okay, that was a lot of information.
you got nothing.
This is how I make a living.
Yeah.
It's
all the face.
Right? It's all the face. So let's drill back in to what controls look like, because we said security controls a lot. We said a lot of things. Don't punch me in the face.
Don't punch Justin in the face.
Please don't. I mean,
Just kidding. He's a
feel
he's
free
a
to come
lovable
up and
guy.
say hi. I'm
Catalina wine mixer. So the other thing that we're going to talk about, right? So we're going to drill into some controls here.
We are.
But as you look at the controls, you'll notice that there's a customer responsibility.
Yes.
And so that's how we're going to dovetail this into our shared security model.
So I pulled up the FEDRAMP security controls baseline for FEDRAMP moderate.
Yep.
And I don't want to drill into this too deeply. We'll go into the NIST controls because I think that's a bigger font. But if you look here at the moderate baseline controls, this is what your security team or compliance officer or somebody hopefully is doing. And this is what it takes to get an ATO.
Yep.
Right, and there's tiny text. I don't expect anyone to read this. This is part of this family of controls here is called out, and then it kind of drills down into things. But if we just pause on one, you'll look at resource availability, and even that is a really big, broad topic, right? So controls can be very broad and very, very specific in ways to meet them, which is why we've provided some frameworks in helping map to how we can do this in a shared responsibility model.
Yeah, absolutely. So this can be very complex and confusing. When you're looking at this from a developer's eyes, you're like, oh my gosh, this is so much to cover, and I don't know how to necessarily approach each one of these controls. Not all these controls are going to apply to you.
Right.
It really is dependent on your application, which is why it's so important when we talk about DevSecOps and the process is to engage your security folks early and often.
Absolutely.
They're going to help you, and by you understanding this piece of it and being able to understand how to go about it, it'll really help bridge that conversation because you're going to say, hey, I was watching this series. Here's how the security piece operates. Here's how I understand to develop my applications securely. And through the compliance mechanisms that we're using, does this make sense? And they'll be able to look at these controls with you and help you make that determination.
Well, they'll pick their jaw up off the floor.
Yeah,
They'll go,
yeah.
really?
It's always
good.
impressive. Yeah, it's always impressive when the developers come in and talk security. And the other thing that you can do, right, that's really helpful is if we look at the services in scope site, so aws.amazon.com/compliance/services-in-scope, that site, by memory, right? Yeah. That site is going to show you the different compliance regimes underneath of it, right? Look at that.
Yeah.
With each one of the regions that it's available in, the service that's gone through the approval process, and then whether or not it's ready. And what you'll see is if it's a check mark, that's a service that people are using. It's ready to go. You can pull that control set into your application and start using it today. If it says 3 P-ATO assessment, that means we've sent it out to our third-party assessment organization who's validating that the AWS implemented controls are going to meet the standard for that compliance regime. Right. And then they're going to help us build the artifact to submit to the JAB.
Oh, yeah.
So the JAB review is the Joint Authorization Board. That's who's actually that's who's actually going through the process of approving it as the governance body for that regime. So FEDRAMP, JAB, DoD, CCSRG, JAB, they're going through the process of saying, yes, this is good, please allow users to use it. Another status you might see on here is ready. That means we've gone through the JAB process, but no one's picked it up for a system ATO. So it's under the provisional ATO that AWS is granted by the governance body. So it's readily available to you to use, but no one's applied it to an actual agency ATO. So a lot of moving parts there, but if you use this and you use the services that are outlined, then you're good to go. This isn't restrictive though. So understand that your authorizing official or your AO has the ability to look at any service and do their own risk assessment. This is just from that top level what we've gone through the compliance regime. And if you need additional services, reach out to your SA.
Absolutely.
We certainly can help push those through.
We can. So let's talk shared responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a
big
fun
deal.
one. I'm gonna move over here, and you might have seen this slide before. This is a good slide.
Yeah.
I like this slide.
Yeah. So it basically showing that at that line of DMARC, that dotted line, that's where AWS is protecting the security of the cloud. Everything below that line. Gates, guns, and guards to hypervisor is the way I describe it. AWS is managing those security controls. Those are inheritable by you and your organization. As that line, as you look above that line, that's where the customer's responsibility really comes in. Understanding the application component, the data that you have, how you store that data, who has access to it, the encryption of that data. Now, the line of DMARC might move up a little bit depending on the service that you use.
Sure.
Right, if you go into a managed service,
Absolutely.
Some of those components are actually handled for you. But ultimately, if you just think like basic EC2 instance type deployment, you have to manage the stigging, right? The security, the IAVA, all of that of those individual OSs, of the application patching, of whatever database engine you install on an EC2 instance, all of that, right? You're managing that, and then you're managing the key, you're managing the network ports and protocols, and upstack.
Yeah. So that's thumb number one.
Yeah.
Right, is the shared responsibility model. If you understand the shared responsibility model, you are well on your way as a developer to being aware of what you need to work with and what you need to get. But that takes us to thumb number two.
Yeah.
I'm going to run out of thumbs here. Thumb number two, you mentioned a little bit about, and that's the classification of your data. And the classification of your data is more than just putting a stamp on it and a piece of paper and throwing it in a vault, right? It's a lot more than that. And let's dig into that a bit, Mike.
Yeah, so when we talk about classifying your data, we're talking about understanding the components and the makeup of that data. So when we talked about the impact levels, knowing, does my data contain FOUO material?
Sure.
Is there PII in there? Is there mission critical data in there? And based off of that, you go back to that services in scope, and it'll tell you, look, here's for the Department of Defense, here's the impact level for data that's PII, PHI. Like, this is what you use. These are the services that are approved. And then there's additional architecture types that can help with that. If you look at that NIST High Quick Start again, right? That's giving you the basic framework and architecture that you can deploy. And out of the box, it's going to give you a FISMA moderate to FISMA high environment that you can start off with. And we run, for the Department of Defense, we run compliance workshops quarterly, but a security workshop for your organization is another way to go, where we can come in with SAs and help you better understand what compliance regime you need and what these architectures look like and how to deploy them.
Absolutely.
And then we deploy it as code, right?
And that's the best part.
Yeah, it's secure.
It is. So to break it down for some of us who are a little slower, it's about the context of the data that you're dealing with and really understanding what that data is and how it needs to be protected. You mentioned PHI, and PHI is extremely important to protect, to meet HIPAA, right? And so understanding that that's what you're dealing with rather than a non-identifiable piece of data, you treat those two differently in the cloud. And that's because it's not an on-premise environment where it's all locked away, it's behind everything, right? You're operating in a cloud.
Yeah, I mean, the real reason things like FEDRAMP and the CCSRG came about is because there was concern, like, hey, we want security in the cloud. And some of those, have really good guidance that makes a lot of common sense approaches very feasible in the deployment process.
Even on premise.
Yeah, they should. Some of them definitely should be leveraged on prem as well, because you want to have a better understanding of the data that's in your data set.
Absolutely.
And that visibility isn't always there on premises, right? Because everything kind of sits together on a SAN or a NAS.
Sure.
When you get into AWS, using services like Macy and looking through the data sets that you have to pick out the PII by pattern matching are really important things to go through that process so that you can understand the data. And then understanding how data aggregation works, because if I'm storing data and say I'm storing everything in one SAN on prem, that might not be the best solution when we move to cloud. So you have to look in how you tag that data, how you secure that data, using different encryption pieces, which we're going to talk about here shortly.
We are.
But really understanding how that data needs to be split out, and then on top of that, understanding that your code is just as valid from a data perspective.
Oh yeah.
We also want to classify the code and artifact it.
Yes. Which brings us to our third thumb. Yes, it is. That's going to be a GIF, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we've been throwing around artifact a lot. It's technically a noun, but let's verb it up. We actually have AWS Artifact, self-service portal for pulling compliance reports, which I believe Ted will put in the chat, and it'll go into whatever link role that we have.
Yeah.
I don't know. But what about your artifacts? And when you build code, the secure CI/CD pipeline that we talked about that does checking and all of that, there's going to be things that were used in the building of the code. And that can go from a comment to an architecture diagram, and any artifacts that you can provide your compliance or audit officer that will help them understand what your code is doing, what your application is doing, and how it does it. They may be developers with a developer background, they may not. Regardless, their focus is not necessarily on how is this code, is it pretty, whatever. It's I need to understand this piece quickly and thoroughly so that I know if it meets it or if we have to go back to the drawing board.
Yeah, and so in part of that artifact creation process, things to think about, right?
Yeah.
So understanding the documentation of the code, but also understanding how ports and protocols are leveraged.
Oh yeah.
What ports and protocols are open and being used between the application and the database tier, or the front end and the app tier, and having those documented in a matrix.
Yeah.
Literally a spreadsheet.
I mean,
that's critical, and it actually becomes one of the key artifacts for going through any ATO process. Another piece would be, just like Justin said, having a diagram. I used to call them the crayon drawings, because you would draw boundary boxes around your environment, and then anything outside of that box, you'd have to baseline as an inheritance control. So you sit within a secure enclave. Here it's the same thing, right? So that VPC boundary would sit within the AWS boundary from an inheritance control. You might have a connection back to on-premises. That connection could be an IPsec VPN tunnel. And again, that's another control set that I'm going to inherit and then linking into my on-prem environment. But you have to have an understanding, right, of how all this ties together. And your security operator or security authorizing official will also want to have some view of that. So if you start building those artifacts up front, it's going to really pave the way to answer the compliance questions, to go through the risk management framework and acceptance.
So we're at 3 thumbs. This last thumb is a fun one. Can I get it? There we go. I feel better about life. Okay, so let's talk about keys. Can I get your house keys?
No.
Car keys?
I've seen you drive.
Yeah, I still wonder about that. Yeah. So Mike isn't going to give me his keys, and depending on your compliance framework, you probably want to keep control of whatever key material you're using, right? It's the same thing in the cloud, and that's something that we've talked about KMS quite a lot in this series, which is kind of fundamental to managing keys. And using keys with our services. But what does that actually give you from a developer perspective, Mike? We can talk about one of your favorite topics, cryptographic erasure.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that.
So when we talk about keys, we're talking about not just the implementation of keys and what service and which key to use for that service, but also the fact that we can do key rotation. So through KMS, we can automate the process of using multiple keys, which allows us to do things like, then I lost it. And it allows us to do things like envelope encryption. Yeah. So different sets of data are being encrypted with different keys.
Yeah.
This allows us to break up the remediation as well. So if I have a corruption of data or a corruption of a key or help us, we get popped on something, well, the cleanup is really the matter of deletion of the key, and any data that's been encrypted with that key is now unusable and deleted. I think we have a question here from the lounge. Yes, Ted?
Yeah, so someone was wondering about KMS and whether they can import their own keys into that if they have existing keys that they've been using.
Sure. So within KMS, it's actually only AWS keys today. We do have Cloud HSM, which does allow you to import your key material. It attaches to a specific account. Again, it's a matter of what type of keys you want to leverage. The other side of this is if you want to continue to use the HSM solution that you're using on premises, using IPsec tunnels to connect into your VPC, or creating a direct connection, which peers and extends the network on-prem into your VPC, will allow you to continue to use the same HSM solution.
Yep. And to go back to some of the earlier episodes we had, we showed the creation of a key, a customer managed key in KMS, and then the rotation of it using Lambda on a particular rotation schedule.
Episode 2, right? We actually showed the key revocation and how you couldn't access that data. And
now you know why.
Yeah, super powerful.
It is. Thank you, Ted.
Yeah, and so, as we go through the process of looking at encryption, we should be dancing like no one's watching and encrypting like everyone is.
Thank you, Werner.
Yeah, right. And so every place that we can encrypt, we should. So we should be encrypting in flight. We should be encrypting data at rest. And we should be ensuring that even internal to a VPC, that we're following best practices for encryption between subnets.
Right, absolutely. Now, one more talk, a little bit on in encryption in flight. We can talk about TLS and making sure that we're using the correct TLS standard. We talked about 1.2, I think, back in episode 1, and why that's important. Or was that episode 2? It was an episode.
Yeah.
And your compliance framework will probably require a certain level of TLS compliance.
Yeah, I mean, depending on the standards regime, I mean,
Yeah.
pretty much everybody is requiring
Yeah, at this point.
encryption in flight, and TLS being the de facto standard.
1.1
1.1
or higher,
minimum.
but
Yeah.
1.2 is the standard.
You know, those are the baselines. So, you know, table stakes really when you're talking about how users are going to access your environment and what encryption standard to build towards.
Yeah. So in the time we have left, let's run through those thumbs again, because honestly, if you walk away from this entire 5-episode,
5-part series, yeah.
then with just those, I feel like that'll be valuable.
Yeah.
And you'll really shock some people in a DevSecOps environment here. I know I'd be shocked.
You know, as someone who's actually helped on the RMF side of things, yeah, if I had a developer come in and say, here's the 5 things. Rule 1, shared responsibility model.
Shared responsibility model. Rule 2 is classifying your data.
Rule 3, artifact your code.
Comment your code. And rule 4, not all encryption is the same. Understand it and understand when to use it.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's pretty good.
Yeah, that's pretty solid. If you guys can and gals can take that away, I think we're going to be looking pretty solid for developers developing secure applications securely, moving into the future as well.
In the secure
cloud, secure cloud,
securely.
secure applications securely.
So one thing, if you have compliance-specific questions, we do have an email address for you that we can put on the screen here in a minute. Do you remember it off the top of your head?
Yeah, awscompliance@amazon.com.
Yes, this is something that can, in addition to the links we put in, help you meet certain compliance standards. Also, reach out to your solutions architects. I don't just say that because I am one, but we are here to help. And in this sort of thing, we have specialists. This is their job.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about this all the time. So anything we can do to help. And the compliance email is also a way to get access to our artifacts package. If you don't have account access and you just want to see what those packages look like and you have a need to know, we can definitely get those shipped to you. And so I think a good recap here of our series, you know, episode 1, we covered basic security.
Securing the outer edges of that account, right?
Right. MFA,
Yeah,
how to create the secure account, how to lock it up.
And we brought it in a bit.
Yeah. So episode 2, we talked about how to secure your app's infrastructure,
right.
the key management, the VPC, security groups, NACLs.
It's hugely important.
Yeah. Episode 3 was building secure code.
Right. And we talked about OWASP, the top 10 that everyone has memorized, I'm sure, since then. I'm confident in our viewers here.
Yeah, me too.
Because I've certainly memorized it. I've got it bookmarked.
And then episode 4 last week was securing the non-static code, the CI/CD pipeline.
And it changes, how it changes.
Yeah.
That's good.
And then today, you know, we covered the big hairy beast, the compliance piece of it. So, you know, I think hopefully you've taken something away from this. We've had a lot of fun with it.
We have. I don't get to wear tinfoil hats that often.
and so, you know, please give us feedback either in the chat or, you know, we'll send a survey out.
Yeah. So if you've subscribed, that's a word, to our alerts for this, I believe we'll be sending a survey. You can give us comments. You can tell us what you liked, what was good. Please put it in the chat as well. This is a good time to give us feedback right now.
Yeah. And so check in with Ted one more time.
Ted, any pertinent questions?
No. There's a bunch of helpful links in the chat about NIST compliance and quick starts and our survey. So please check all those out, and just thank you for joining us these past 5 weeks.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna give another, just 4 thumbs.
4 thumbs.
This is the important bit right here.
Remember those rules, and remember, hug Justin.
I gotta make a living, people.
But thanks for watching, and with that.